Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, when he's introduced the first formulation of the Categorical Imperative, which is act only on that maxim that which you can at the same time will that it should be become a universal law of nature, Kant actually gives you some examples, and he gives you four in that section, in section 2 of the groundwork. But he also gave you another one earlier with the question about the shopkeeper. Should he give a good price or not, a fair price to all of his clients? So we're going to look at the Kant's examples, and then in another video we'll look at some other examples that Kant could have considered but didn't consider that might help you drive this home a little bit more. So he says, we'll now enumerate a few duties following their customary division into duties towards self and duties towards others. And this is an important idea. Sometimes people think that we don't actually have duties towards ourselves, we only have duties towards other people, that, you know, when it comes to ourselves, anything goes, we can do anything we like, because so long as I don't affect other people, it doesn't matter. I'm a moral person. And there are certain moral theories which see it that way. Kantian deontology doesn't see it that way. Instead, it views it as there being certain duties which you actually have to yourself, which you have to observe. I'm actually going to skip the first one and come back to that in a moment, because I want to start talking about duties towards others, because I think we have a better conception of those on a gut level than we do duties to ourselves. So he says, another person finds himself driven to borrowing money because of need. He well knows he will not be able to pay it back, and he sees too he will get no loan unless he makes a firm promise to pay it back within a fixed time. So the question here, you got a person who needs something or wants something. The question is it okay for them to make a lying promise to pay back a loan? So he says he is inclined to make such a promise, but he has still enough conscience to ask, is it not unlawful and contrary to duty to get out of difficulties in this way? So we can broaden this. What is the maxim here? The maxim is something along the lines of, when I find myself in difficulties, I will make a lying promise to get myself the resources I need to get myself out of the difficulties. So Kant actually puts it like this: whenever I believe myself short of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, though I know this shall never be done. So he says, this principle of self-love or personal advantage is perhaps quite compatible with my own entire future welfare. So, you know, if I think about this only from the perspective of prudence, you know, whether this would turn out well for me by doing this sort of thing, then it doesn't sound like a bad proposition, because I'll get myself out of the trouble, so life goes on nicely for me. But I can ask myself, is this right? And the categorical imperative is saying, again, remember, act only on that maxim, only the things that you can actually make fit this set of rules, this set of criteria here, only those things are actually right. So he says, how would things stand if my maxim became a universal law? What would it be like if I imagined a world in which everybody, whenever they found themselves in difficulties, would make promises with no intention of ever keeping them? So he says, I see straight away this maxim can never rank as a universal law of nature and be self-consistent. Now that's a really important term right there. It can never be self-consistent. It would be inconsistent, but it must necessarily contradict itself. For the universality of a law that everyone believing himself to be in need can make any promise he pleases with the intention not to keep it, here's where the key point is, would make promising and the very purpose of promising itself impossible. No one would believe that he was being promised anything, but would laugh at utterances of this sort as empty shams. So what Kant is saying is, if you try to imagine this, or try to think out what this would be like, try to wrap your head around a world in which everybody has the maxim that whenever I'm in some sort of difficulties, I will make a lying promise, then the very notion of promising begins to unravel or collapse. Kant portrays it as if it happens immediately. You think this out and you just see it like that. I'm not quite so sure that it suggests itself so readily. But in any case, that's what he thinks is going on. So that tells you about something that is a strict duty to other people. You actually have a strict duty, according to Kant, not to make lying promises. So another way of putting that is, when you make a promise to somebody, you have to fulfill that promise. You have to, at the time that you're making it, intend to fulfill that promise. That's a duty. Now let's look at a strict duty to the self. So now we're dealing with something that we don't normally think that much about when we're doing our ordinary ethics. We don't often think of ourselves as having duties to ourselves, and when we do talk in that way in our ordinary kind of common sense morality, it's often so that we can indulge ourselves when we haven't indulged ourselves for a while. And that's very different than what Kant would actually go along with. So he says, imagine a case where a man feels sick of life as a result of a series of misfortunes that has mounted to the point of despair, but he is still so far in possession of his reason as to ask himself whether taking his own life may not be contrary to his duty to himself. Not his duty to other people. So he's not talking about somebody saying, I can't kill myself because I have to take care of my spouse and my children, or because it'll make people upset, or anything like that. He's saying, look, take all that aside. Do you have a duty to keep your life going on, even if you are no longer happy in your life, even if you're miserable? So he says, he now applies the test, can the maxim of my action really become a universal law of nature? So what is the maxim then? Kant says that the maxim is, from self-love I make it my principle to shorten my life if its continuance threatens more evil than it promises pleasure. Let's read that one more time, because that's kind of a mouthful. From self-love, I make it my principle, so it's my maxim, that I will shorten my life if its continuance threatens more evil than it promises pleasure. So if my life is going to be disagreeable to me, I will shorten my life. So this doesn't necessarily have to be like, driving off the bridge, or shooting oneself, or taking the pills. This could be, if my life, the horizon of my life doesn't look very good to me, it looks like it's not going to be very nice, then I won't do anything to take care of myself. It could fit into that as well. So, what would happen then if we imagine a world like that? He says, it is seen at once that a system of nature by whose law the very same feeling, that is self-love, right? The very same feeling whose function is to stimulate the furtherance of life, should actually destroy life, would contradict itself, and consequently could not subsist as a system of nature. So Kant is saying there is a contradiction there in this case, in that the very impulse that you have of self-love to take care of yourself, to further life, to strive after things that you'll actually enjoy, would be turned against itself and sort of nullify itself. So he sees a logical contradiction there. And he says, because there's a logical contradiction in that, you can't make it a universal law of nature, so therefore you can't act on that maxim if you want it to be moral. It would be immoral to kill yourself. So, those are strict duties. Now let's look at less strict duties, what we call meritorious duties. And again, let's start with other people. Meritorious duties to others. So he says, a person is flourishing, so he's doing well, but he sees others who have to struggle with great hardships and whom he could easily help. And he thinks, what does it matter to me? Let everyone be as happy as heaven wills or as he can make himself. I won't deprive him of anything. So this is a person who says, I'm doing well. I see other people who are in dire need or are suffering, and I'm not going to help them. I'm not going to hurt them, but I'm also not going to help them. I'm just going to leave them there. So if they're starving, let them starve. If they're cold, I'm going to let them be cold. If they are grieving, I will let them grieve. You could think of, actually, you could run down the whole Beatitudes, right, for this thing, He says, I won't envy him. I only have no wish to contribute anything to his well-being or to his support in distress. Now, Kant says, you can actually make that become a universal law of nature. That is conceivable. There is nothing inherently contradictory in a state of affairs in which everybody, like he says, everybody just, keeps their hands off of everybody else, doesn't help anybody out, and just, treats them as well as they can, but without, actually improving their condition. So he says, such an attitude, if it became a universal law, mankind could get on perfectly well. So imagine something like a pure marketplace where human beings just treat each other according to the rules of the game, and nobody tries to improve anybody else's case. So he says, actually, this would be better in some respects than if everybody prates about sympathy and goodwill and even takes pains on occasion to practice them, but on the other hand, cheats where he can, traffics in human rights, or violates them in other ways. So he's saying, this is better than a case of hypocrisy. As a matter of fact, this is one of those things where you might actually have an example here. Kant would say hypocrisy would be violating a strict duty to others. Beneficence, doing well to other people, that's a meritorious duty. He says, you can imagine a world in which everybody says, screw everybody else. I'm not going to take care of them. They're on their own. I'm not going to hurt them in any way. I'm not going to take anything away from them, but I'm not going to do anything to help them out. You can imagine that world. Can you will it? It doesn't make sense, Kant says, to will a world like that, because you would be willing a world in which you yourself might actually need somebody's help sometime. And if you think about this in very practical terms, you come into this world needing help, and you actually need help for a great many years, and many of us will actually leave this world needing other people's help as well, and sometimes for a great many years as well. So this is not something purely imaginary. This is something that's part of the human condition. So Kant says you can't will it, which means that it becomes a meritorious duty to help others. That means that if you don't help others, you're not actually going contrary to a strict duty. You're not being immoral, but you're not being moral. You're being moral if you do in fact help other people. The other case that he talks about would be a meritorious duty to yourself. This is a very interesting one because this actually ties into the whole idea of education. And education as something, now Kant's not saying, this is something I'm saying. This ties in with the idea of education as being something that you take ownership of, as we say these days. So he says, a person finds in himself a talent whose cultivation would make him a useful man for all sorts of purposes. But he sees himself in comfortable circumstances, and he prefers to give himself up to pleasure rather than to bother about increasing and improving his fortunate natural aptitudes. So, this person could be developing themselves into the kind of being who would actually make other people's lives in some way better, would help them out. But he says, hey, I've already got it, pretty nice. I don't need to do that sort of thing. I don't need to develop myself. And this could be going to trade school. This could be working on their moral dispositions. This could be going to college or university, learning a discipline. Instead, he says, I'm just going to take it easy. So he asks himself, though, does my maxim of neglecting my natural gifts, besides agreeing in itself with my tendency to indulgence, agree also with what is called duty? So again, Kant says, let's think about this. Can you think of a world? Can you imagine, can you wrap your head around a world in which everybody would behave in such a way? Nobody would develop themselves. Everyone would say, well, I've got perhaps talents, but I'm not going to work on them because things are nice enough for me already. And he says, yeah, you can imagine this. A system of nature could always subsist under such a universal law. Although every man should let his talents rust and should be bent on devoting his life solely to idleness, indulgence, procreation, and in a word, to enjoyment. Could you have a society, if you want to put this in our terms, could you have a society purely of consumption and enjoyment and not of self-development, self-cultivation, education? This is a live possibility in our world, isn't it, for a lot of people? Would that be the right thing to do? Kant says, you can imagine a world in which this occurs. There would be an inconsistency in willing it. And the inconsistency in willing it is very, very different than the inconsistency in saying, with the meritorious duties to others. I might, find myself in a world where I need help or something like that. In this one, it has to do with the very nature of a rational human being. And he says, he cannot possibly will that this should be a universal law of nature or should be implanted in us as such a law by natural instinct. For as a rational being, he necessarily wills that all his powers be developed, since they serve him and are given him for all sorts of possible ends. Now that's a really interesting thing to say. Kant says, as a rational being, now remember, we're not always fully rational, right? As a rational being, he necessarily wills that all his powers be developed. So within every person, even the person who's just a pure consumer, doesn't do anything, lays around, watches TV all day, eats potato chips, drinks beer, and pick whatever else you want, and they don't develop anything. Insofar as they're a rational being, they're going against their rationality. They will that they develop their talents, their abilities, their possibilities, that they develop that potentiality into actuality. Kant thinks that we all have a meritorious duty to ourselves to improve ourselves. And that comes from our rationality. That doesn't come from the fact that it's going to make us rich or anything like, or that we enjoy what we're studying. Kant thinks that this is part of our duties to ourselves. The other case that Kant does talk about with the shopkeeper who gives fair prices, that would fit into strict duties to others. And you could apply the categorical imperative to that as well. You could say, can you turn cheating into giving an unfair price into something like a universal law of nature? And if you imagined a world in which everybody would give an unfair price to everybody else, I think Kant would say there's going to be an inherent logical contradiction to that world. The very notion of fairness and price would just sort of vanish and disappear. You'd have no way of comparing it, and so it would become inconsistent. So we have four main and a few other examples that Kant gives of how you actually apply this categorical imperative. I hope that this has helped you in understanding that, and we'll look at some other examples in another video.